Hi, I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Today, it's my pleasure to be speaking with Joy Lisi Rankin, whose book, A People's History of Computing in the United States, is timely, well-researched, interesting, perhaps somewhat controversial, ultimately a really great book for people who want to know a little bit more about where we came from and perhaps inspire where we could go. If you want to see Joy's reading recommendations, be sure to check out tinapp.org. And I guess since Black Friday is coming up, I will make the stickers and anything else available that we sell, which I guess right now is only stickers, but hopefully it'll be more. What should we do? Like 75% off? Okay. If you're interested in supporting tinapp.org, get some stickers, 75% off, only for the holidays. Thank you so much, Joy, for being on the show and speaking with me today. I'm interested in your idea of computing citizenship. You start off the book by sort of saying we have lost our notion of computing citizenship, and I'm wondering, is it gone, or is it simply less prominent than it used to be? How do you envision computing citizenship today in the 21st century?
Today, I really envision it as computing consumption, or that we are consumers of technology, that we are buying devices or using platforms and social media that really don't offer or enable the sort of full sense of citizenship in all of its dimensions that was promised and envisioned, and in some cases like actualized in the 1960s and 1970s relative to technology. So in the book, I talk about really this moment in time when in the late 1970s, when, for instance, Apple starts selling personal computers, and when all of the basic programs that had been, or programs written in the basic programming language that had been sort of freely available and freely circulated started really being closed off and sold. And all of a sudden you had to buy a computer, you had to buy a disk or buy software. And that hadn't been the case. Those were things that had been sort of accessible to computing citizens in these communities during the 60s and 70s.
We see today's advertisements for Facebook, for example, or for social networks, or for a lot of the apps that are available. There's a lot of language of social interaction, community building, and that kind of thing, which seems to fit nicely discursively into communities and citizenship. What's the difference between these 1960s ideals and all of this talk about sort of, if not citizenship, then at least community? What's the difference in these communities?
The first and foremost thing I would say, and this is obvious, but it also bears emphasis, is that Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on, these are all businesses. They are out to make a profit, and they absolutely use the rhetoric of community and connection, but the bottom line for them is the bottom line. They are interested in selling stuff to people, selling ads, selling apps, selling things you can buy in the app, selling consumer goods, whatever the case may be, or also selling data, selling information that's collected from all of these users. So sure, there's a rhetoric of social interaction. And yes, when you log on to Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, you can see what your friends or your family are doing. But it's really worth remembering that behind all of that is a business out to make money from you, even if you don't think that's the case, even if you're not buying anything directly through Facebook or Instagram, that still your data is being collected and used, and that you are not only a consumer, but also a product as well. And that's not at all computing citizenship. That is all about business and buying and selling. In the 1960s and 70s, these computing communities, in contrast, were really built from the ground up around these shared interests of seeing the utility in computing and networking and a desire to share programs, bank software, help other people, connect with them. It was a vision of a communal good. And as I say, from the user up, not an idea of a business, a top down, a selling. So I think that's a huge difference between the computing citizenship of 50 years ago and what's spoken of as community or social connectivity today.
Mm-hmm. Do you see that changes being made today, if changes were made today, we could return to a sort of computing citizenship similar to, in some sense, the 60s, or has that been gone for good?
I would say part of why I wrote this book is with the hope that telling this history could at least inform conversations about and possibilities for the future. That cuts both ways in the sense that I talk about these computing communities of the 1960s and 70s being collaborative and oriented for the public good, but they were also very much products of their time. Computing can't be divorced from the culture in which it arises. So it's why I talk about how computing becomes masculine at Dartmouth College, or talk about the ways in which women complained about harassment on the Plato network, even in the 1970s. So it's to say we've really got to recognize that technology is not at all sort of separate from people. You know, technology is made by people, it's produced by people, and people are social and cultural and have all of their all of the biases and moments of the time and place that they're in that shape how they are with that technology. So it's more to sort of use this history to be thoughtful about the present and both the limits of the present and maybe what we would want to change for the future.
Your book title, of course, sounds similar to Howard Zinn's famous People's History of the United States, and you do that consciously, as you say. What was the inspiration behind referencing, to some extent, Howard Zinn? What did you see in his work maybe inspired what you're doing?
First and foremost, origin stories matter. And so as I was even beginning the research for this book, it seemed to me that there's very much of what I call the founding fathers origin story of digital culture. It's sort of a focus on homebrew hobbyists or Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Page, and Sergey Brin. So, right, this idea that like only a few people who happen to be white men created change. And to me, that was a pretty limiting history. And so I was really writing against this founding fathers story of digital culture and saying, no, actually, there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of everyday people who were creating computing communities, making personal and social computing. So to me, that history is more optimistic and empowering because it's a history of many different people creating digital worlds. And it's a call, too, to say, like, let's look for more of these stories. Let's listen for more of the unheard voices when we think and write about technology in the past and in the present.
As a reader, that sounds really enticing. As a scholar, though, that sounds really intimidating to think that instead of the founding fathers, who are fairly easy to identify by now by the histories that we've already been hearing, to think about the thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who helped build computing. That's a huge history. How did you even begin to think about tackling that?
I came to this book with my own history. So this is sort of a three-part origin story for this history and how I came to sort of think and write about and even find all of these people or sources about them. And it's before I did the work of graduate school, of getting a PhD, I worked launching educational programs, often involving technology. So for example, an online English website for people learning English as a second or third or fourth or whatever language, online advanced placement courses for students who didn't have access to them in their schools, that kind of thing. And in that work, over the course of a decade, what consistently surprised me and my colleagues is how creative students, their teachers, were with whatever sort of technology they were using. It was always clever and imaginative and social, and never quite in the ways that we expected it to be used, but brilliant. And I thought, I mean, for me, that was sort of an inkling of like, oh, there's more going on here. Like, these individuals and these communities aren't just sort of passive end users. They're doing more than that. So that's part one. Part two is I did my undergraduate work at Dartmouth College, which is featured prominently in the book. But even in the 90s when I was there, had a very rich computing culture. I didn't pick up the phone when I was at college. Students, faculty alike, everyone emailed each other. We called it blitzmail. We blitzed each other. And I knew just from sort of being immersed in that culture at that time that there was a longer history. It was sort of something talked about at the college, although certainly not to the extent that I discovered when I was researching my book. So that's part two. In the course of my research, I came across this great sort of classic in the history of technology called Computer Lib by Ted Nelson. You can and must understand computers now. And it flips actually to another sort of the same book flipped called Dream Machines. And it was from 1974. And sort of on the 5th page of this book, I'm looking at it right now, there's a map called Where It's At USA in Computing. And it's sort of what's happening in the United States, according to Ted Nelson. And there's sort of what I expected. There's a focus on the Boston area, which was big in computing at the time, and a focus on the Bay Area and the DC area. And there's like a little sketch of ARPANET. But then some surprises popped out, like the University of Illinois for Plato. And Dartmouth is on the map. And Minnesota, in particular, Control Data and UNIVAC. So basically, I started with Dartmouth and this map and sort of looked for the kinds of sources that would let me tell the story that I thought I wanted to tell, focused on many people rather than a few. And certainly, as I say this, I know there are still sort of a few key figures in the book who helped me tell this story, but they are windows to many thousands more high school students, middle school students, college students using the networks that these individuals help me narrate the stories of those networks.
When you were writing this, were you envisioning a reader who is, significantly computer literate, maybe writing programs at home or something, or were you envisioning a novice, or what kind of technical skills do you think about, or did you even think about that really?
I did think about it, and I was really thinking about a novice. To me, it was important to be able to convey, and in some ways the sources help with this, to sort of convey the enthusiasm that my actors, as they were coming to computing and coming to writing programs in BASIC, the enthusiasm they felt, and also the approachability of the systems and BASIC itself. So in some ways, I think I was inspired to make writing about all of this technology, which I studied and I sort of, worked diligently to learn and understand myself at a level that I think, or I aim to make it much more accessible to someone who doesn't have any kind of programming background or specifically technical background.
Yeah, and I can see why someone with a strong technical background would want to read A People's History of Computing. Why is it important for a more general public, which as you said, that's sort of the readership you're thinking about as you're writing. Why is it important for them to read and to understand this kind of history of computing?
Well, I think this comes back to the origin stories matter. So I talk in my book about the Silicon Valley mythology, this idea, which is also goes hand in hand with the founding fathers' idea for the history of computing or digital culture. I think very broadly in the sort of general imagination, people sort of say, yes, everything happened at Silicon Valley. And it was just a few key guys or a few key companies. But that creates a disconnect. It seems like sort of technology is handed down from on high, certainly from sort of a few to the many, as opposed to why people should read a People's History of Computing is to say, here's another history that points to the many and to public institutions and students and teachers and boys and girls who are actually making personal computing, making social networks, and participating very much in making the digital world.
One of the most interesting things to me, because I think anyone dealing with computers today, it's still sort of amazing how quickly it developed and how much cheaper everything got very, very quickly in the few decades that it took to go from, say, 70s to 90s to 2000s. But one of the interesting things was the vision of these people in the 60s and 70s, imagining what it would be like in the 2000s and so on, basically where we are now. And by now, we were supposed to have, I think, a very different picture. Like you said, for one thing, as a public, the internet as a public utility, computing as a public utility, it went in a different direction. Why do you think that was?
I've thought about this a lot. And
I'm sure you have. That's why I'm asking you.
And it's a tough question. I think there are many different factors coming into play all at the same time, including sort of the 1960s, I would say, being the heyday of sort of public faith in governance and public utilities, sort of then mirrored in the 1970s by sort of a call for deregulation and less government involvement. And at the same time, a lot of the sort of broader American cultural move towards consumption. I think Liz Cohen's book, A Consumer's Republic, was always in the back of my mind in thinking about how ideas around American citizenship and participation became tied to and sort of intertwined with being consumers, increasingly in the sort of post-war, Cold War era. And I think that's coming into play as well with the idea of like, yes, let's consume personal computers. Let's buy these things. And then eventually it becomes, let's sort of consume the internet. But it wasn't inevitable and it wasn't overnight either. I think Minnesota was the great case in that it's very clear, even as they're moving into the 1980s, the people who are part of the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium, MAC, which is this statewide network, they still think that their time-sharing network is crucial and is not easily replaceable by personal computers. But MEC also goes the way of privatization and sort of becomes company to be sold. So I still think a lot about this, and I think there were a lot of factors at play. And I would also hope this is a point at which I can say other scholars can help think too about, what were other histories of computing in the 60s and 70s and 80s? How did they sort of lead to where we are today?
Yeah, well, actually, that's one of the questions I want to ask you is that towards the end of the book, you talk about how yours is hopefully the first of many alternative or people's histories of this field. What else are you particularly interested in hearing about potentially from other scholars, especially when you think about the fact that if you take away or you move away from this founding father mythology and think about the myriad groups and people involved in the history of computing, what did you not get to tackle and what do you hope others will?
The 1980s, the early 1990s. And I know I have colleagues who are working in this area, but for me, the 1980s especially is sort of, it's this moment in time where computers are moving into homes and moving into schools. And I think I'm very curious as to like what were people doing? Like how were they computing? What are even now, what are memories of that time and the use and how computing sort of became part of home life or school life or business life in a more nuanced way than like, aha, the personal computer has arrived. And the same for the 90s in sort of looking with more curiosity, and I should say 80s and 90s, looking at sort of various bulletin board systems, networks that did exist during that time, like the East Coast Hangout, Echo in New York, and just really sort of taking a step back to say, like, let's write those histories, like I say, from the user up, from with really attention to what people are doing rather than sort of an idea of the machine or the network as technology somehow removed from people.
In thinking about the work that you were doing and these other potential histories, are there other mythologies, like, for instance, the Founding Fathers, that you would really like to see more people challenge or throw away altogether as an idea or belief? Other mythologies or other common, maybe mischaracterizations of computing in history?
I would say one of them, and it's maybe like a subset of the Silicon Valley mythology or closely related, is just that the internet was built by the military, or sort of very much a focus on military origins as well for ARPANET and the internet, because that is certainly part of the story, but it's not the entire story. And I think in many cases that sort of emphasis on the military, on this ARPANET becomes internet narrative, really obscures, again, like the diversity of actual computing that was happening. And in fact, the sort of computing happening not just in the United States, but around the world. And we're starting to happily get some of those histories, some of those stories in terms of histories of Soviet networking and what's happening in France with Minitel, what's happening in England with like the BBC computers, this kind of thing. So those all make me very happy.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that's interesting always when doing a project like this and looking back is that I think some people could say that, the story of computing is really the story of the Second World War, for example. And they wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but that, of course, is a very limited idea compared to the story of computing is the story of hippies in California or something like that. Like, as you sort of highlight, there are a bunch of ways of thinking about this diverse historical moment. How do you weigh the accuracy or the importance of these various moments? Because I don't think that you can say that any history of computing is correct or relevant, but at the same time, you can't easily say that there's only one history. How do you sort of weigh the different claims of historical accuracy when you're dealing with this complex narrative?
I think it's a question of emphasis and interpretation. And so, hearing about like, the history of computing is the history of World War II. Like, absolutely, in some ways, a lot of ideas central to computing that developed afterwards, were formed in the United States and England during World War II. However, sort of if you then point to World War II, you can say, yes, but that's a moment in time where we see a transition from computers being a term that refers to people who do mathematical computation, and those people are often women, to computers being machines. And it sort of adds another layer to the story. The same thing with pointing to sort of say, well, the computing we know is very much a product of the counterculture. It's a yes, but. And so I wanted to add another layer of complexity to that story. And even to me, another thing that was important was weaving gender as an analytical point into the story and saying gender is everywhere in this book, even when I'm not explicitly calling attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
And gender is often something that hasn't sort of, when you say, computing is about World War II, or if someone says computing is about, ARPANET becomes internet, the sort of people fall by the wayside, and the fact that people are actively constructing gender falls by the wayside. So putting the people back into a history of computing in this way also enables putting gender into the history of computing. And it's certainly something other scholars have done great work with, but often focusing on the professional realm. So people who do computing for work, and looking at these networks. In the 1960s and 70s, the time-sharing networks let me look at gender for people who aren't necessarily doing computing for work, but are doing it for recreation, as part of school, as something they enjoy.
How did you find the response to the book and the work, the arguments that you're making? Have you found that it's relatively easy to make these points, or are people potentially attached to certain histories, and seeing this additional one might, disrupt that?
It's both. I would say, some people are very absolutely attached to saying, the history of computing is and should be a particular way, and it's sort of a history of dates and bits and bytes and machines and code. Certainly, that's one kind of history of computing, but I think my sense has been there are many more people, and certainly this was the case when I was giving conference papers and sort of seeing some of the early comments on my book, that many more people are excited about this kind of history, sort of a people's history, precisely for all of the opportunities that it opens up and the ways in which it challenges the sort of handed down narrative, the sort of accepted wisdom of the Silicon Valley mythology.
Well, that sounds good. If you had to give advice to someone, say somebody is either going to do a sort of people's history of maybe the 1980s computing era or something like that, any lessons that you've learned that would be really helpful to share with another scholar doing similar sort of work?
I was so pleasantly surprised by the value of newsletters and informal publications. I mean, those were the gold mine that I wasn't expecting to find in some ways. And certainly I know for the 80s, there are tons of personal computing publications that I suspect would be an amazing source of material for thinking and talking about and analyzing what people are doing with their computing. That's one thing that I would say. And the other is just to sort of, I think, try to find a few people or a place or a way to sort of hang a story of the many on, so that rather than trying to manage a cast of hundreds of characters, there are just a few who might illuminate what's happening more widely. But I imagine there are many, many different possibilities for doing this.
When you were collecting archival stuff or newsletters and these kinds of things, did you have certain ideas of where you were going to place your chapters, geographically, but also theoretically, I guess, in terms of the ideas that you were going to explore? Or did that come from after reading many things like these newsletters or like maybe publications that you found? How did you take this huge mess of history and different things going on and start to make sense of it as a writer?
For me, the geography was key, in that I had or sort of decided to have 3 distinct regions or sort of networks to organize the stories around in some ways. And then to say, when I have a chapter that's going to back out to a national level and sort of do a top down as opposed to a user up, that I would just call attention to that and say, this chapter about public utilities is going to be a different chapter than the others. But that only came as sort of work in progress. Like I had no idea, I sort of decided on these three networks fairly early on as potential places to investigate because they seem to have good archival possibilities. But for example, in the case of Minnesota, I had no idea that I was going to come across all of these newsletters of ties, which is one of the computing communities and networks that becomes part of MEC, the statewide network. No idea they existed. And when I found them, they were amazing. So some of it was planning and some of it was serendipity.
Did you have these certain characters, if you want to think of it like that, or these certain people? Did you have them in mind, or did they appear? And if so, either way, how did you know that they were right for the way that you were constructing this history?
I did not, I would say with the exception of John Kemney and Tom Kurtz, with whom I was familiar simply by virtue of being a student at Dartmouth. Sort of, I had them in mind as a starting point. But other characters like Linda Borey or Valerie Lamont or Dale LaFrenz really appeared in the course of my research, in the course of turning up what was in the archives, in the course of looking at oral history interviews and saying, here are people who can help me tell the story of what's happening with others. Like Linda Borey is one of the teachers who goes from ties to MEC and is encouraging hundreds, if not thousands, of students in computing in Minnesota and teaching them basic and teaching them programming, but also writing programs herself. So one person who I can highlight as saying, here's a connection to many.
And actually, it just occurs to me then that you're talking about BASIC and some other early computer programming languages. Were you able to use those? Like, were you using an emulator or something like that? Or did you have to just read about those? Because it's not particularly easy to find a lot of these older historical programs and to use them on modern computers.
Right. Dartmouth in their archives, there are printouts of old, and by old I mean like 1960s old BASIC programs. And of course, there are, and I should stop here to say, I think many people, when they think about BASIC and its heyday, they think about the 1980s. And I'm the person saying, no, wait, like we can go back to 1964 and find BASIC programs and BASIC manuals. There is a Dartmouth alum who had maintained, and it's sort of been up and down, an emulator of like the circa 1965 Dartmouth time sharing system, where you could actually run BASIC programs from that era. So I tinkered with and tested out learning some BASIC myself and trying some of the programs and seeing what happened. And I had also had some background in teaching myself how to code, so that seemed like a reasonable undertaking. But I haven't checked in the past few months if that emulator is up. Even in the course of doing my research, it sort of was up and down periodically, but it was a great resource for being able to do this kind of work.
No, I mean, that's interesting because we think, I've been reading some other stuff lately on print culture. And even though we think about a digital age, every 5 years or so, it seems that you can't use the things that existed before unless there's some special circumstance. So the history of computing actually may be harder than some, 1,000-year-old documents if they're well preserved in books, because you don't need an updated program. Is there anything else that you think is a challenge for people doing computer history or that kind of technological history as opposed to maybe sort of more classic history?
I think you've hit upon the sort of one of the keys that a lot of my colleagues are grappling with very actively is sort of the like, if you actually have a disk from the 1980s with a program on it and you want to use it again, how do you do that? Or if you have a BASIC program from 1965, can you run it? Really sort of understanding and then being able to revisit, preserve, analyze, understand those kinds of computing activities from the past when they're not easily accessible. And I think another aspect to that, although I think sort of this is true for all historians, is in some ways the histories that we write are always informed by the present. and especially now, given the ubiquity of digital culture, it's to sort of walk the line between saying, oh, this seems to me like X does today. And therefore, I'm going to draw a straight line from X of 1970 to X of today. So there's the danger, as opposed to saying, like, let me take 1970 on its own terms, and try to really understand how people at the time understood what they were doing in their own terms, even if some of what they're doing looks really familiar to what we might do today, like texting or instant messaging or screen sharing.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point, I think. And your pictures, the photos, some of the photos that appear in the book are interesting in that, for me, the keyboards stood out. They just look so awkward from the point of view of, 2018, because they're not ergonomic. They seemed like it would take significantly longer to type on. And in some cases, it's obviously arranged in a somewhat different way. But we tend not to think about these things when we're thinking about the ideas as opposed to the materiality. And I think that's another interesting aspect of the book, that it highlights what it was like maybe to be doing these things at that time, as opposed to what's often a history of the present, where we look at it from, like you said, from our perspective today and just think this is how we got here. And, it was almost like inevitable. I mean, there's so many interesting things that I think can be picked up from the book. One of my last questions, or maybe my last question then, if you get the ideal reader, or if you get the ideal reader response, what kind of ideas, thoughts, maybe actions afterwards are you hoping, or would you hope to see?
I'm going to put a hold on the ideal reader response. Just because I wanted to come back to the materiality, because I'm glad that you brought that up. And it's one of my favorite things. There are many favorite things, but one of the things that really stands out to me that came out when I was sort of reading material about Dartmouth, and I'll talk about Dartmouth and Plato. Dartmouth is how many people recalled, like, how noisy it was in the teletype rooms, and how difficult the keys were to press, and like what a racket it was, because in one of the public computing rooms, you'd have like 20 teletypes with printing and people clanging on the keys, and then also people talking because they're socializing and collaborating, or they're playing multiplayer football, but really just like noise of all kinds that I think we wouldn't necessarily imagine. And similarly, one of the other like delights, one of the things that I love is when Plato, when they're building this, they build their own keyboards. And one of the early keyboards has an aha key, like AHA exclamation point, I think, because sort of part of their idea in using this for education is that a learner, a student, would sort of hit a certain point in a help sequence and like literally have the light go on, and they would press the aha key to sort of say, I've got it, I understand, take me back to sort of the question I was supposed to be answering. And those moments of materiality to me were sort of really got at the like, there are people here and they're doing things that involve all of the senses, that involve sound and touch and sight. So yeah, I just wanted to say that because I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, no, like I said, it really does help put you in that situation, which I think is missed in a lot of histories, because you're thinking about how did you develop this code, or how did you develop this program, and we focus on how we got to where we are, but thinking about where they were in these noisy basements. I love the anecdote you have in here about a woman, I think, who learns on one of the like keyboards or something upstairs and then goes downstairs to see the actual mainframe and has no idea what that is.
Yeah, I think it's one of I think it's like students from one of the so Hanover is the town in which Dartmouth College is located, and I think it's students from one of the Hanover schools go to see like what computing at Dartmouth, and people at work on the teletypes, and they're getting their printouts and they're engaged with computing, and then they go to the basement and see the mainframes, and the young woman says something like, oh, but I didn't understand like that big machine that looked like a refrigerator. But for Kemeny, he highlights that as like crucial. It's the sort of from the perspective of someone using the network, like if you're using the telephone network and you sort of pre-mobile phones, you pick up a telephone, it sort of masks all of the phone lines and operators and connections and sort of everything happening behind the scenes. And in the same way, Kemeny was saying, like, oh, you look at a teletype and someone's using a teletype to create computing, and they don't necessarily need to know about the phone lines and the mainframe in the basement that looks like a refrigerator and sort of everything happening behind the scenes, because for them, that teletype is their point of access to a network and a much wider world.
Yeah, and I think that, it highlighted for me at least, thinking about, history from our present day. I mean, that to me was very much like the cloud, where we just, click on things, use programs that don't actually exist physically than these mainframes, except they're just much further away and much faster. But we don't really know about them, just in a similar way I see now, that people understand the teletype, but they don't necessarily understand any of that stuff that's hooked up that, without it, it wouldn't function. But, well, now, how about we go for that ideal reader?
All right, so the question was basically along the lines of, if there was an ideal reader response, what would that reader go out and do?
If you heard readers after reading this book had these ideas, did these actions, whatever consequence you would love to see in a reader, what might that look like?
I would say one of them is to sort of go out and make more space for or call for more funding back to public education at all levels, in the sense that K-12 education was not where technology went to die. I think the prevailing view in some cases now, and this is not my view, is that K-12 students and teachers are just passive recipients of new technologies. And I think that's a huge blind spot. And I think my book shows how creative they were in their computing and in their creativity. And my book highlights the centrality of education as a site of collaboration and innovation. So also showing the benefit of, and maybe having the ideal reader call for national and state and local investment in education and research, but with sort of a mindfulness of creativity and play in using those technologies. And I know some of this is happening, for example, with like different uses of artificial intelligence, like in classrooms, students sort of creating their own sort of various forms, not just of AI, but other kinds of technologies and programs. And I think those are all worthwhile endeavors. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is to have readers step away and be a little bit more critical of the ways they use technology today, and what trade-offs they have made sort of individually and thinking about collectively in terms of privacy and surveillance, rights or citizenship, in the different ways that digital technology is every day. Here, I'll leave it open-ended. I would say sort of as after people sort of think critically and sort of take a step back, a step removed from thinking about their technology use today and how it's so quotidian and mashed, to think about what computing citizenship could look like and what changes they could call for in their communities or ask of their political representatives. I'm not asking too much, just maybe that my readers go out and like change the world. But
I think, a book's not worth reading if you don't do that. If you don't have that hope, I think.
Yeah.
No, and I think that's a perfect way to sort of wrap up, is by returning to this idea of computing citizenship, because one of the striking things in the book is that it just seems so open in the 60s, like so much potential. And I think in many cases we've lost that because, as you say, we've maybe too easily accepted the consumption-only practices. And I mean, it's not that everyone who reads your book has to go out and change the world, but I think you might be able to inspire some of your readers too, and I think that's a really great thing. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today, Joy.
Thank you, Chris. I really appreciated it and enjoyed it.
As always, thank you so much for supporting This Is Not a Pipe podcast. Be sure to get some holiday stickers for yourself and all your friends, or just make a donation. Anything helps and keeps this thing going. I hope everyone listening has a wonderful holiday and gets to enjoy some good books.